And here we go. So, good morning, everyone. A beautiful Friday morning, the 30th of May. I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. Today, we're going to look at the directory in the French Revolution, as well as the rise of Napoleon, and we would be greatly remiss if we did not cover Francois Noël Brebeuf, an early communist radical. So even in this conservative last stretch of the French Revolution, last in our perspective, our vantage point with the benefit of hindsight, we can still see some of those old Jacobin sorts of revolutionaries were out and about. Before we get into things too much, one look at an announcement here, and that is going to be concerning Miss Angela Malik and her offerings as regards music. So let me pull up our Restauratio Center page. And if you're unfamiliar, we've opened up in the past year this separate sister school, let's say, the Restauratio Center, which is a more anodyne version of Apocastastasi. So, very, very professional, as they say, in the commercial sense of the word. In other words, there's nothing on this site that could be at all controversial. And so we have just straight up tutoring, college prep, and so forth, stripped of all wacky ideas that the staff over at Apocatastasis get into. But in any case, here you will see our spring 2025 feature, this beautiful painting of Angela at the piano. If you've seen our previous interview show, we've certainly had Angela on a couple of times, as well as at some of our conferences like May Day last year, 2024. Angela spoke on sacred music and church music, which is her specialty. She is classically trained in the European model, and we are so honored to offer a collaboration with Angela to our larger learning community. And you can see the PDF here, and you can get into contact with her, as well as not just email, but also the telephone. And she can give voice lessons and things of that nature, chant lessons via Zoom and StreamYard. So that again is on our Restauratio Center, and I will shortly have this up on Apocastasasi's proper site as well. And this is our indeed sister school, the Restauratio Center. Our respectable cousin, if you like. Okay, so now on this continuing meditation on the French Revolution, we're going to have a poem. And this is going to be from William Blake. Now, this week we've taken a little bit of a diversion. We spent the beginning part of this week looking at H.G. Wells, looking at the outline of history as a project in toto. And then yesterday, we looked at the project in toto, and that way I don't have to keep repeating myself as to what this is. But in a nutshell, the project, of which this is an outreach, this very broadcast is an outreach, is our synchronized, unified curricula for our enrolled students, as well as our alumni, our monthly seminarians, and our larger learning community. And people, depending on their interest and ability to commit time to this reading regime, are able to vary the commitment, whilst at the same time we're all topically studying the same material. It's a marvelous synthesis that we've developed, and our developing. You can find out about the project in our tab down in the description. We have a special page with our previous classes, as well as the free reading material that you'll need to join in this adventure. But a part of that project is indeed poetry. And I thought none better than William Wordsworth to give us a poem on the French Revolution. Words, Mr. Wordsworth, as the old Twilight Zone has it, one of the sketches there. So this poem is entitled The French Revolution as it appeared to enthusiasts by William Wordsworth. O pleasant exercise of hope and joy for mighty were the auxiliaries which then stood upon our side, we who were strong in love. Blessed was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. O times in which the meager, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law, and statute took at once the attraction of a country and a romance, when reason seemed the most to assert her rights, when most intent on making of herself a prime enchantress, to assist the work which then was going forward in her name. Not favored spots alone, but the whole earth, the beauty wore of promise, that which sets, as some moment might not be unfelt, amongst the bowers of paradise itself, the budding rose above the rose full blown. What temper at the prospect did not wake in happiness unthought of? The inert were roused, and lively natures rapt away. They who had fed their children upon dreams, the playfellows of fancy, who had made all powers of swiftness, subtlety, and strength. They are ministers, who in lordly wise had stirred amongst the grandest objects of the sense, and dwelt with whatsoever they found there, as if they had within some lurking right to wield it. They too, who of gentle mood, had watched all gentle motions, and to these had fitted their own thoughts, schemers more wild, and in the regions of their peaceful cell. Now, was it that both found the meek and lofty, did both find helpers to their heart's desire, and stuff at hand plastic as they could wish, were called upon to exercise their skill, not in utopia, subterranean fields, or some secreted island, heaven knows where, but in this very world, which is the world of all of us, the place where, in the end, we find all our happiness, or not at all. To autumn domine miserere nobis, that's William Wordsworth, French Revolution, as it appeared to enthusiasts. Look at that great memorable line. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was the very heaven. O times in which the meager, stale, forbidding ways, etc. Bliss it was in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. Okay, so indeed, we got our Wordsworth in. And now we're speaking of words, we move along with our focus from the outline of history, which is, if the poetry is the heart of the project, I suppose this is the, I don't know, what simile do you want? The skeleton of the project, the lungs of the project, whatever the case may be. H.G. Wells has a few words, not very many, on this sobering up stage of the revolution, where the Jacobins have been ousted. This is called the Thermidorian reaction, the conservative reaction. So the radicals who had brought war to France on many borders, had brought upon a blockade by the English, had declared war, genocide in the Vendée and Brittany, had made the guillotines sing as the blades cut through the Paris air. Those Jacobins had been deposed in short order. And it's a tremendous meditation on the fickleness of power, that they were so so routed so quickly. There is a grand film in French that you can get from Apocatastasis' site for free. Just go to our tab Films of Whimsy and Interest, and should you do that, you'll see a French production called Robespierre. And this Robespierre, uh, from the I would reckon the late 1970s, with the French version of George C. Scott. It always impressed me as the actor who does Robespierre, French George C. Scott, um, gets into the last weeks really of the Jacobins in power and the different splits amongst them. So you can take a look at that for free, and it has, of course, subtitles. All right, so we're going to change the camera now, and I just want to do a tech check with the audio. Okay, there we go. You always have to be careful that the background music is not too loud, and therefore obnoxious, but I think we're okay. I think about 25 to 35 percent volume seems to be good when it comes to background music, depending on the file. Now I'm changing the camera so that we can look directly at the outline of history. There we go. Yeah, there's not too many paragraphs on the directory, but there's enough to work with here. And we're going to look at the bottom of page 728. 728. And now that we've sobered up from that Jacobin period, we move along here. The Directory was victorious abroad, but uncreative at home. Its members were far too anxious to stick to the sweets and glories of office, to prepare a constitution that would supersede them, and far too dishonest were the Directory members to handle the task of financial and economic reconstruction. Remember, France is enmeshed in wars because of the loud mouths and loud pens of the Jacobins, demanded by the condition of France. We'd only note two of their names: Carnot, who is an honest Republican, and Barras, who is a conspicuous rogue. Their reign of 5 years, and the Directory is in power for that time, 5 years, formed a curious interlude in this history of great changes. They took things as they found them. The protagonist zeal of the revolution carried the French armies into Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, South Germany, North Italy, that's your Napoleon. Everywhere kings were expelled and republics set up. Switzerland will, of course, become the Helvetic Republic. The Belgium and Holland will be given another Latinate Roman name. So it's interesting. We talked about that in the context of the American Revolution. In fact, the influence of the classical Greco-Roman world on things. So you actually have whole countries being given back their old Roman names. But such propaganda zeal as animated the Directory did not prevent the looting of the treasures of the liberated peoples to relieve the financial embarrassment of the French government. So the assignat, which the National Assembly had issued, was completely worthless, and so that was replaced by another currency that the Directory came up with that was pegged to land. But that very quickly devalued as well. And so, in fact, I believe the Directory had a ceremony outside where they burned the printing presses that that cursed France with all of this revolutionary money. So there's a lot of financial embarrassment. Hence, you have the looting of artwork. That's coming back. The looting of these conquered provinces. The wars of the Directory became less and less the Holy War of Freedom. Think back to 1793, the Battle of Valmy, for instance, and more like the aggressive wars of the Ancien Regime. The last feature of Grand Monarchy was that France was disposed to discard. Excuse me. The last feature of Grand Monarchy that France was disposed to discard was her foreign policy. That continued almost as if one of the Louis were reigning. One discovers it still as vigorous under the Directorate, as if there had been no revolution. All right. Now, it's during this time period, as I put a new article on screen, that we have the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who's going to take up so much time, and rightly so, next week. And we'll get our fill of Old Boney. But this article, lest we get too conservative, not wanting to rock the boat after the Jacobin uprising, is a hearkening back to the good old days of Jacobin insanity. So this is Gracchus Babeuf and the Conspiracy of Equals from the worthy site worldhistory.org, which I make copious use of in class, the most helpful resource. Gracchus, of course, so those of you who know your Roman history, you know Gracchus, or rather the Gracchi, were the two brothers who promised land to the proletariat of Rome, and so they're held up as proto-communists almost, certainly Democrats in the general sense of the word. On 10th May 1796, in the later stages of the French Revolution, a group of left-wing agitators were arrested in Paris, charged with plotting to overthrow the French Directory. After a series of trials, 2 of them were guillotined, 7 were deported, and the extremist Jacobins were once again kept from regaining power in France. We recall again this term left wing and right wing comes directly from this very French Revolution, where you would have originally in 1790, let's say, Louis XVI sitting in the middle of the National Assembly, and then the more constitutional sorts, constitutional monarchy and monarchist sorts would be to his right, hence conservative, hence right wing, and then the more radical democratic Republican artisans would sit to Louis's left, hence radical or left wing. So we get this language, right wing and left wing, directly from the French Revolution. And it is during the period of the Directory that you have not just until they're outlawed here again, Jacobins wraithing around, soothing their wounds. But you also have, during this conservative period of 4 or 5 years, the return of many, many emigres. Many of the nobility and the clergy who had fled France earlier in the revolution now feel that it's safe enough for them to return. Here we have an image from the trial of Babeuf, Gracchus Babeuf, although his proper name was François Noël Babeuf. The Gracchus is kind of a nom de plume, harkening back to the Romans. What could have been a minor footnote in the history of the French Revolution becomes something more when one of the surviving conspirators, the Italian-born Filippo Buonarroti, wrote a book detailing his recollections of this coup that never was. This book, entitled Buonarroti's History of Babeuf's Conspiracy for Equality, was immediately successful, selling over 50,000 copies. It ensured the survival of the story of the Conspiracy of Equals, as well as that of its protagonist, an idealistic dreamer called Gracchus Babeuf. Looks like he dies at about 37. So interesting, as we certainly know from American history and from all history, really, the battle to write the narrative after the fact, and the enduring power of that narrative. Mm, MSG. I mean, look, have you ever walked into a McDonald's and seen a hamburger that looks like that? That's ridiculous. That hamburger, either of those patties is about 3 times thicker than any hamburger you're going to see at McDonald's. That is a ridiculous picture, however yummy and non-kosher. A Baruch conspiracy is famous not for its impact on the French Revolution, which was minimal, but for its effect on later political thinkers and later revolutions. Babeuf is considered to be a proto-communist whose ideas bridged the gap between French Jacobinism and the socialist movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. During Babeuf's lifetime, the terms communist and anarchist did not yet exist. Yet both these terms have been utilized by later scholars to describe Babeuf's ideas. He maintained that true equality could not be reached only through uh, the complete abolition of private property, and that the state should distribute goods equally among the people. He believed that society needed to be individual would desire riches or power over others. Good luck. Babeuf and his failed conspiracy would later be praised by Karl Marx as, quote, giving rise to the communist idea, unquote. And Babeuf himself would be called the first revolutionary communist. You can skip the early life. It's not so pertinent for us. We want to see Babeuf during the days of the Directory. And here's a note on his name. Babeuf also championed an equal redistribution of land, similar to the agrarian laws of the Roman Republic. Babeuf's personal heroes were the Gracchi, of which the singular is Gracchus, the Gracchi brothers, the ancient Roman tribunes of the plebs, who fought for similar land reforms and who were both assassinated for their efforts. Babeuf took steps to identify himself with the brothers, first through the name of his newspaper, Les Tribunes des Pupils, Tribune, like the Gracchi, the Tribune of the plebs, and then through the self-styled nickname of his, Gracchus. Now, his revolutionary career. Babeuf was in Paris shortly after the French Revolution began in 1789. On the 4th of August, as the National Assembly was meeting and passed the August Decrees, which abolished feudal Jews and made Babeuf's feudist occupation obsolete, collecting those dues, Babeuf applauded the decision nonetheless, writing to his wife, "Whatever it costs me, can go to the devil." He decided to try his hand at political journalism instead and traveled to the town of Roye in 1790. He wrote in defense of the poor and attacked the policies of the aristocrats in the National Assembly. His rhetoric earned him 2 brief prison stints in 1790. This is probably the most common image of Francois Noël Babeuf that you'll see floating around. What an early stovepipe hat, huh? A little bit ahead of its time. A little bit 1830s. In 1792, Babeuf became an administrator in the new revolutionary government for the General Council of the Somme Department. He served in this position until he was caught committing forgery, forcing him to flee to Paris in February of 93 to avoid the punishment, which was a 20-year prison sentence. He did not stay free for long. That autumn, he was arrested for unrelated reasons and was left to languish in a Paris prison for 6 months, released only after the fall of Maximilien Robespierre. That's the Thermidorian reaction, right? That's where the old conservative people, those who become the Directory, seize power from the Jacobins, who had certainly let that power go to their head. After Babeuf's release, he initially wrote in praise of the conservative Thermidorians, for bringing an end to the terror and referred to Robespierre as Maximilian the Exterminator. So interesting. So we associate Babeuf with maybe those very same radicals, and yet at the time he would beg to differ. This was an interesting reaction, completely at odds with the rest of his career, and perhaps reflected the general atmosphere of relief in Paris directly after the terror, as the looming threat of the guillotine was finally subsided. I mean, that's why you have all of those emigres coming back. Their chances of being executed are not as potent as they once were. But Babeuf soon returned to his old ways, founding Les Tribunes des Peuple and attacking the bourgeois Thermidorians for their conservatism. He was arrested again in February of 95, and his newspapers were burned by the Muscadians, a group of foppish thugs. Interesting merger of two adjectives, foppish thugs, who were dedicated to rooting out left-wing extremism. Babeuf was transferred to a prison in Arras, where he became influenced by other radical prisoners. Most significantly, he became acquainted with Filippo Buonarroti, an Italian national, we met him before, who had become a French citizen in 93 and worked as a low-level administrator in the Robespierrist regime. Through his conversations with Buonarroti, Babeuf come further to be radicalized. He came to believe that property redistribution was not enough, and that the concept of private property had to be completely abolished for true equality to be attained. It was around this core idea that the conspiracy of equals was born. Babeuf, Buonarroti, and their associates were released from prison in 1795. The conservative royalists were becoming an increasing threat to the new French Directory. I'm sure they'll mention it here, but I'll beat them to the punch. It's during this very time that Napoleon infamously fires on a mob of those very same monarchists. Again, they're getting a little bit uppity now that they don't have to worry about the guillotine. Give them a whiff of grape shot, as Bonaparte said. Babeuf was released at the beginning of a harsh and dreadful winter, one that exacerbated the sufferings of the poor and seemed to highlight the societal imbalances under the Directory. Babeuf resumed publishing Les Tribunes des Peuples, voicing ideas that were far more radical than even the most extreme Jacobin had ever been. What is the French Revolution? Babeuf wrote. An open war between patricians and peasants, between rich and poor. The revolution, he argued, must not be allowed to end until it moved into its final stage, which was a class war. Now, are you seeing why he's taken to be an early communist, proto-communist? Class war. He believed that things had been heading in that direction under Robespierre, but had been derailed when the bourgeois Thermidorians seized power and restored society the way it had always been, with the rich. Babeuf's rhetoric found a large audience, particularly with Jacobins and sans-culottes, who had been forced from the political stage. His paper was widely read throughout northern France and sold sold 2,000 copies within weeks of its first release. Again, newspapers in the 18th century are the internet. After the publication of the first two issues, the police were sent to arrest Babeuf, but he was hidden by a sans-culotte supporter. By mid-February of 1796, passionate readings of his paper were a common occurrence in the Pantheon Club, a place where radical leftists gathered after the closure of the Jacobin Club. After members of the Pantheon were heard denouncing the directors as tyrants, the club was closed on the 27th of February by soldiers commanded by General Bonaparte. You see, the Pantheon has a later history in France as well. Now, this is not, of course, the Roman Pantheon. But it serves almost as author's quarter does in Westminster Abbey. So a lot of very notable Frenchmen, including, I believe, Victor Hugo, are buried in the Paris Pantheon. Okay, why do they link me to the Roman Pantheon? Okay, well, this is exactly not the Pantheon that I wanted. But anyway, it's a nice building. Coming up on Pentecost, they will throw bags of rose petals down the Italian Pantheon, not the French Pantheon, which this mislinked me to. Okay. So notice our first mention in text of Napoleon Bonaparte. Just moving on down here. There's a painting, very romantic painting, very dashing debonair painting of Francois Noël Brébeuf. You can see him holding the tricolore. You can see him with his cockade on his hat. He's not wearing a Phrygian cap, but he does have the cockade, symbol of the revolutionaries. Of course, the whites or the monarchists just had the color white, and the white cockade is their symbol. Notice also the use of the pipe, right? So kind of a dashing look to him, and some nice, comfy slippers by the looks of it. Anyway, this did nothing to dissuade these neo-Jacobins, who began a secret organization which they named the Secret Directory of Public Safety. Members of this group included Brébeuf and Buonarroti, as well as Jacobins who are better known to the public. Okay, moving ahead a little bit. What is this conspiracy of equals? The goal of the conspirators was to overthrow the Directory, which they viewed as a corrupt government that was leading France back into the oppressive fog of despotism. And it is interesting to note that with revolutions, how they cycle from a radical phase often into a conservative phase, sometimes ending back in a place completely indistinguishable from before the revolution. Like that in the American Revolution, also the Russian Revolution, there's an initial burst of radical energy, and then it's tamed and brought to a conclusion, typically by those conservative forces. Their conspiracy of equals was based around the belief that private property should be abolished and that all land should be communal. This necessitated a strong authoritative central government to ensure things ran smoothly. The state would be responsible for the equal distribution of goods, which should be doled out according to each individual's need. Then it gets into some factionalistic points. We'll just bring this to a conclusion. Okay, trials, executions, and legacy. In February of 1797, Brébeuf and his co-conspirators were transferred to the Vendôme in iron cages to stand trial. Of the 120 men who had been arrested in connection to the conspiracy to depose the Directory, 65 were tried. Of those, 56 were acquitted. Brébeuf had played a significant role in the conspiracy, but had never been its leader. But for political reasons, he received the lion's share of the blame and was sentenced to death on 26 May 97. Upon hearing the verdict, he attempted to commit suicide and stabbed himself multiple times in the courtroom. Once we had the painting at the top, which we'll return to. None of the wounds were fatal, and he was guillotined the next day without appeal. Another conspirator, Garth, was also guillotined, while Buonarroti and 6 others were sentenced to deportation. None of the others were punished. For the next 30 years, now we're moving into historiography, Brébeuf's conspiracy and the events become known were remembered as nothing more than a minor footnote in the history of the French Revolution. But in 1828, Buonarroti wrote his History of Brébeuf's Conspiracy for Equality. In it, Buonarroti recounts his memories of the conspiracy and relays the main tenets of Brébeuf's ideas. This, 1828, gave rise to Brébeufism, which acted as a bridge between Jacobinism and later communism. The book was successful, selling 50,000 copies, Through Buonarroti's efforts, the conspiracy of equals served as an inspiration to later political thinkers. Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx referred to the conspiracy as the first appearance of a truly active communist party. And Leon Trotsky regarded Babeuf as the founder of the communist legacy. Okay, so we'll bring the bird down there as we shift gears. And, because its nature was conservative, because they had to mop up a lot of problems caused by the Jacobins and the previous National Assembly, the directory was, it was slow, it was procedural, so it certainly was not radical, and if you were inclined that way, you would see it as something of a cop-out or a sellout. Well, in any case, it is this type of dithering that Napoleon will take advantage of. Napoleon at this point is doing his wars in Spain and Italy and making a name for himself there, as his brother Lucien is making a name for himself back in Paris. And it is during this, this perception of incompetence, almost like in Weimar Germany, that Napoleon will come to power, as we'll find out. I never pass up a chance to show off my little Trotsky finger puppet here, which I actually don't recall. I might have got this guy on the internet, and the Trotsky button that the Trotsky finger puppet is wearing is something I picked up in Union Square on a May Day. I was lately asked, although it has seen some days, that I don't know why it's gotten scratchy there. I can't see that too well. Little discoloration there. Anyway, Trotsky's turning black. I was lately asked, am I a communist? No, I'm not, but I take shameless cues from communist rhetoric, and I suppose very appropriate on this day of Francois Noël Babeuf, this type of intermediary, certainly a radical figure, maybe more radical than the Jacobins had been when they were in power. But there we go. So that's officially the French Revolution from 1789, July 14th, Bastille Day, to Brumaire. Was the 18th of Brumaire. We'll find out next week when Napoleon takes over. That's your official French Revolution. Do you include Napoleon and that epoch as the same French Revolution? In one way, yes. In one way, no. We can talk about that next week. But we are certainly going to be shifting gears, looking at those Napoleonic campaigns and that whole phenomena, which he was. Neither revolutionary nor conservative, drawing from both, being a third thing altogether. Quite something. A Bonapartist altogether, its own creature. But we'll leave it there. We've had a great week. Of course, we had Memorial Day, kind of cut down on our classes this week to 4. Then the first 2 were looking at H.G. Wells and the Outline of History project in Toto. And then yesterday we did our grand recording on the project, so I don't have to keep repeating myself. I can just send you, like a flight control man, right over to that link, and you can watch it as you please. And then today we're back on the history wagon, just in time for the weekend. But hey, we're ending the week, and so we're ending the French Revolution prop and beginning something new in a new week with Napoleon Bonaparte. So with that being said, thank you for watching. Please do consider, especially if you have children or in need yourself of singing classes, please do consider taking advantage of Miss Angela Malik and our collaboration with her. You can find that poster on our Restauratio Center, and by the time you see this, also on the great website of ApocatastasisInstitute, the main page. Check that out. And in the meantime, get reading, and I'll catch you next week. Take care now. Bye-bye.